You see, if you think that science is the only way to truth, you will go a step further and you will end up believing that science is coextensive with rationality. That is a fatal mistake. But let's look at the first thing. We call it scientism. Science is the only way to truth. Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher and mathematician, put it this way. What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. That sounds very impressive. And he was a wonderful logician, but his logic left him at this point. Because, and I hope it's not too late at night for logic, ladies and gentlemen, because the statement, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know, is not a statement of science. So if it's true, you cannot know it's true. Got that? It's logically incoherent. It goes too far. And it was a Nobel Prize winner, Peter Medawar, in Oxford, who put the record straight by saying there is no quicker way of bringing down criticism against science by claiming that science can answer every question. It is obvious that there are questions that science cannot touch. For instance, and he gave these examples, the simple questions of a child. Where did I come from? Where am I going to? What is the meaning of my life? And he said it's to literature and philosophy and religion that we must turn for answer to these things. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in a culture centre tonight. If science is the only way to truth, you'd have to shut this place down. And you'd have to shut down half the faculties in your university. Where would history go? Anthropology, art, music, languages, literature, and so on, they would disappear. Einstein saw the point. And he put it this way. He said, you can speak of the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot speak of the scientific foundations of ethics. And he saw that you cannot answer ethical questions by science. Now that's a huge contemporary debate, incidentally. But that's not the topic of my lecture tonight. But it's a very important one. Because there's such an ingrained impression that science is the only way to truth, that some people are now claiming, including Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, that science can solve the age-old ethical dilemma of David Hume. I don't think it can, but that would take us too far from our subject tonight. We want to get back, and I'm going to use Stephen Hawking because it's a very useful thing to do, because his book is very clear about certain issues. He raises the interesting questions at the beginning of the book. How can we understand the world? What is the nature of reality? Where did it come from? Does the universe need a creator? And as you read it, and as I read it for the first time, I thought this is going to be very interesting to hear a world-class scientist address the big philosophical questions. But when I read about 2 sentences further, I got a shock. And the shock was to read this. Traditionally, Hawking said, these are questions for philosophy. But philosophy is dead. It is not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. As a result, scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. So there's your scientism. Philosophy is dead, it says on page 5 of the book, and the rest of the book is about philosophy. That struck me as rather strange to say the least. Hawking's statement about philosophy is itself a philosophical statement. It's certainly not a statement of science. It blatantly contradicts itself. skepticism we can dismiss without losing any respect for science itself. But now comes the next step. Hawking's dismissal of God. I want you to listen carefully to this, because it shows a deep misunderstanding that characterizes a great deal of the debate. Hawking writes, ignorance of nature led people in ancient times to invent gods. This began to change, he suggests, with ancient Greek thinkers like Thales of Miletus about 2,600 years ago. The idea arose that nature follows consistent principles that could be deciphered. And so began, says Hawking, the long process of replacing the notion of the reign of the gods with the concept of the notion of a universe that is governed by laws of nature and created according to a blueprint we could someday learn to read. That means that Hawking is making two fundamental mistakes. Firstly, he is thinking of God or the gods as gods of the gaps. Remember a title, the Higgs boson and God of the gaps. What is this God of the gaps? Well, it's a very simple notion, and it's a very important notion. It's using God as a placeholder, as a substitute for a scientific explanation. Let me give you an example. The ancient Greeks were very frightened of thunder and lightning because they thought the gods were angry. If you do some atmospheric physics and learn a little bit about electrical discharges and so on, you soon can discover that it's got nothing to do with the anger of any gods. So those gods disappear when you give a scientific explanation in terms of atmospheric physics. And so the idea is this, that when I mention God, I simply mean, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, that is a fundamental mistake, but it's so dangerous because it leads to Hawking and many other people today not understanding what I would mean by the concept of God. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the choice that Stephen Hawking offers you and me is this: you must choose between God and science. You can't have both. And I was puzzled for a long time to understand why that choice. And then it occurred to me it's because of his concept of God. You see, if you define God to be what I can't yet explain by science, then of course you've got to choose between God and science. From the way you define God. This is fascinating to me. In other words, you're giving people a choice, but the choice is between a non-existent entity and science. But what if God is not a God of the gaps, but is God of the whole show? God of the bits we do understand and the bits we don't understand. Let me put it this way. Our God of the gaps thinking is very subtle. But let me put it in general. When, in the days of Kepler and Newton, say the law of gravitation was discovered, that didn't mean that people said, we don't need God anymore, we've got a law. No. In fact, Newton dedicated his Principia Mathematica, the most brilliant book in the history of science, which explained these laws, in the hope that the thinking person would come to believe in the deity. You see, because the idea is this: the more you understand of science, the more you admire the genius of the God that did it that way, not the less. And that's the way to go. The more you know about engineering, the more you can admire a Rolls-Royce engine, not the less. The more you understand about art, the more you can admire a Rembrandt and understand it, not the less. And so therefore I would want to emphasize that my position as a Christian is, not the God of the gap. God is the God of the whole show, the God whom I admire more and more, the more I understand of the science of the way in which the world works. So that's the first thing to clear up. There's a false idea about God. There's another false idea about God lurking in that, because he goes back to the Greek gods. Now, I do a bit of debating, as some of you know, and last year I was invited to debate at the Oxford Union. We dress up in dinner jackets, and it's a parliamentary kind of debate, so the House splits, and there's the opposition. So the atheists were there, including Richard Dawkins, although he didn't debate. And I and my colleagues were faced with the following argument. I was very surprised to hear it in the Oxford Union, but nonetheless I heard it then. And the argument was this. You see, they addressed us, me, and said, you are an atheist with regard to Artemis. You don't believe in Baal. You don't believe in Zeus. And they went through a whole list. And then with a great grin they said, we just go one God more. And we dismiss Jehovah, the God of the Bible. And I thought that shows a deep misunderstanding like talking. Because what they're claiming is that the God of the Bible is like one of those ancient gods, but he's not. Bernard Jaeger was one of the most distinguished experts in the gods of antiquity. And I'm very interested in the gods of antiquity, the Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek and Roman gods. And what he says about them is very interesting. He says this: the vast difference between those gods and the God of the Bible is very simply explained. They were all descended from the universe. The God of the Bible created the universe. Now what is meant by that, descended from the universe? What's meant by that is this, that when you do some research onto the nature of those gods, you find that they, let me take one example, I think it's the Babylonian or the Egyptian, they come out of a primeval sea. That's one explanation. That is, they are ultimately material gods. They're part of the stuff of the universe. The God of the Bible is not part of the stuff of the universe. He invented the universe. And so to put God in that category is false. So there are two mistakes. And the lesson for me is this, that when I'm discussing these things in public, I need to check carefully what God we're talking about. Otherwise, we'll not make sense to each other. Now, I have mentioned the false concept of God as a God of the gaps, or as a God like the Greek gods. But now it becomes a false concept of science. And here, the key word is explanation. What does it mean to explain something? What does it mean to explain something scientifically? When I was in school, I was so excited when I first found out about Newton's second law. To think that you could compress this concept of the attraction between bodies at a distance into 8 symbols and deduce from that equation all the elliptical motions of the planets that Kepler had observed, to my mind was stunning. And it's something I got great joy in my life in explaining to students. Just that sheer joy of discovering that the mathematical description worked and you could deduce all this stuff from it. But you know, I made a mistake.